Hey everyone! Today I'm doing a Jane Eyre adaptation comparison focusing on the third conversation, which is the one where Rochester tells Jane about Adele's mother. This will be a shorter comparison video because not every version includes this scene, and a couple of them weave parts of it into the second conversation, which I've covered already. The omission of this scene doesn't bother me too much. It's my least favorite of these three conversations, and its key elements basically reiterate or expand on subjects that have been covered before. Still, it is an important scene. Rochester's desire to confide in Jane is an important step in their relationship, and we do finally get an answer about Adele's origin. Sort of. We never know for sure whether or not Rochester is her father. Whether he is the father or not, but especially if he isn't, Rochester's act of taking in a child who he believes he has no responsibility for says a lot about his latent, compassionate side. And I think Bronte here expresses her own sympathetic view toward children, especially illegitimate ones. Jane, speaking as Bronte's mouthpiece, says that a child is not to blame for its parents' faults, and because Adele is so unwanted, she resolves to love her all the more. Now, as for the adaptations, we'll skip the 1934 version because it does not include this scene. If I remember correctly, Adele is openly acknowledged as Rochester's daughter in this version, and little to nothing is said about her mother. The 1944 version is the first to combine the third conversation with the second. While Jane and Rochester are having their talk, Adele comes in to show off her new dress. That's Margaret O'Brien, one of the most winsome child stars of the 1940s, playing Adele. Rochester's mood immediately darkens and he brusquely sends her away. He then asks Jane why she's looking at him like that, and she answers, very boldly for this Jane, that, quote, whatever his past misfortune, he has no right to revenge himself on the child. And he does agree, admitting that he was being selfish. That one line of Jane's is about all the material from the third conversation that they cover. The 1970 version does a similar thing, attaching the story of Adele's mother to the second conversation, except Rochester goes into a little more detail about the opera dancer who he had an affair with, who cheated on him, and then abandoned her baby that she claimed was his. It's after Jane says Adele isn't to blame for her mother's faults that he has a little freak out and smashes the wine glass. You can watch my video on the second conversation for more of my thoughts on that scene. The 73 and 83 versions... I just remembered that hold on. There we go! The 73 and 83 versions, as you should expect from old BBC miniseries adaptations, do go for full coverage of this scene. Or at least sort of full coverage. 1973 does abbreviate the story quite a bit. I don't think they even mention Celine's name specifically. This is the only version that fully includes Rochester's more cryptic comments. In the book, he stops suddenly in the middle of his story to tell Jane about jealousy, which she's never felt, and then he goes on this random tangent about liking the day and liking Thornfield. 73's script moves this part to the end of the conversation after they've finished talking about Adele and her mother, which makes him seem slightly less distracted. The tight close-up on Rochester emphasizes his fervent or defiant, I will like it, I will have it, I will break every obstacle to happiness, yes, and goodness. 1983 starts the scene with Jane sketching Adele when Rochester comes along and joins them. It feels pleasantly natural to me. What's interesting about this one is that Rochester says very bluntly that Adele is the daughter of a French opera dancer for whom he once cherished a grand passion, and then prompts Jane her reproof or a moral homily. Basically, he's implying that he is Adele's father. He never disputes it or tries to correct Jane for thinking it. That is contrary to the book, in which Rochester adamantly denies that he could be the father, citing that in no way does Adele resemble him. He does stray briefly into talking about Thornfield, mentioning how he feared to come back to it, but he doesn't dwell on it for long, not to the full extent that the book does, and he moves on pretty quickly. It's not quite the strange monologue it is in the novel. The 1996 version surprised me by including this scene. They took some artistic license with the first two conversations, and since it's a Hollywood film, I wouldn't have been surprised if they'd cut this. It's not a note-for-note adaptation of the scene, but it's got sufficient detail to satisfy. It starts with Adele dancing for Jane, Mrs. Fairfax, and Rochester, directing many smiles his way in an obvious and uncomfortable imitation of her mother. When Adele begs to be allowed to stay up, and Rochester barks at her to do as she's told and go to bed, Jane stays behind to take umbrage at his outburst of temper, saying she doesn't care what he says to her, but he shouldn't yell at a defenseless child. This is perhaps the most fired up we ever see this Jane, and I'm not totally convinced that it isn't an overreaction, or should I say, an out-of-place reaction. Firstly, this is probably the meanest we ever see this Rochester, and really, it's not that bad. He raised his voice. But secondly, I don't think an 1830s governess would dare openly reproach her employer for firmly telling his child or ward to obey his order. I'm pretty sure that in the household, the parent or guardian was given precedence. Like the customer, the parent is always right. Like 1996, the 1997 version doesn't go into quite as much detail, but it does have the scene, and it's sufficient, I guess, considering the overall runtime of the adaptation. As I've said before with this version, there are some things I like about the script, some things I don't. Unfortunately, it's the things I don't like that stick out more. I do like that Jane's voiceover alludes to other conversations that we don't see, as the book does, but I don't like that Rochester says he was thrilled when he found out Celine was going to have a baby. Thrilled? Really? That they have Jane say with comical naivete, "So you were married? She was your wife?" Or that Rochester says he felt such pain when he caught Celine with another man. The book and other versions make it clear that his initial jealousy quickly died when he recognized the brainless man she was cheating on him with. If she could prefer such a despicable moron over him, then obviously she wasn't worth it. The 2006 version keeps complicating things by splitting up the conversations into multiple scenes. In one scene, Jane and Rochester discuss whether Adele's blood is tainted or if she can be nurtured into a more intelligent human being. In a following scene, we get the rest of the story. It starts with Jane out for a walk and unexpectedly coming up on Rochester nature gazing. Here they incorporate the business that actually comes from the proposal scene, where Jane sees him and tries to silently back away, but he knows she's there without turning around and says, "Jane, come and look at this fellow." I happen to love that part as an awkward but humorous preamble to the proposal scene, but oh well, I guess it works here too. By the way, this Rochester has long since dispensed with the formality of calling her Miss Eyre. It's Jane all the way now. This version employs a lot of flashbacks, including here when Rochester tells the story of Adele's mother. The way Rochester paints the picture is very slow and sensual, pretty unlike how I visualize book Rochester's more dispassionate, flippant, self-deprecatory recounting. Afterward, instead of asking Jane if she's going to leave now that she knows Adele's story, he asks if he did the right thing in bringing Adele to England. It's nice that he seeks and respects her honest opinion, and I guess he didn't need to ask if she would leave because he already knows that she's not going anywhere. That's the last version of the conversation I have to talk about because the 2011 version does not include this scene. It jumps straight from the second conversation to the fire scene, much as I was tempted to do myself. It's a little odd to me that they omit it though, just because in other places they build up Adele's part, and Jane and Mrs. Fairfax do wonder where she came from. All we find out, unless I'm forgetting something, is that her mother was French and kind of scandalous. I would like to point out here that I do really like the montage they added of Jane teaching Adele, doing projects with her, and reading to her, including telling her the legend of the guy trash. This warm portrayal of Jane's relationship with Adele is one of the more endearing things about this version, I think. That's it for this one. Those of you who are familiar with the story, you know what comes next! I hope you liked this video, and of course if you have any thoughts on the third conversation, I'd love to hear them, so go ahead and share them in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching!